All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Arik Burakovsky and I manage the Russia and Eurasia Program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. We're happy to have you join us today for our panel discussion titled Turkey, Russia, and the West, Autonomy and Contestation in a Changing Global Order. The conversation will focus on Turkey's foreign policy and its balancing act between Russia and the West, particularly in terms of energy politics, regional conflicts, and diplomatic engagements. Turkey is a country with a multifaceted and dynamic foreign policy situated at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. As a member of NATO and a candidate for membership in the EU, Turkey has traditionally had strong ties with the West, but Turkey has also cultivated a close yet complicated relationship with Russia. How is Turkey able to serve as a balancing actor between Russia and the West? How is Turkey able to seek strategic autonomy, particularly amid the Russia-Ukraine war? These are some of the questions that the conversation will be dealing with. We are honored to be joined today by three distinguished experts from the Istanbul Policy Center in Turkey. We're pleased to be hosting them here at Fletcher today. We're also delighted to have one of our visiting scholars moderate the conversation. Özgür Özkan is a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School. Özgür's research lies at the nexus of international security and comparative politics with a regional specialization in Turkey and the Middle East. I will turn it over to Özgür to introduce the three esteemed panelists, and they will each have 10 minutes for opening remarks. Özgür will then ask them some questions. I guess 12 minutes for opening remarks is what we agreed on. And then we will invite questions from all of you from the audience. So please, Özgür.
Thank you so much, Eric. Welcome all. Thank you for coming here today. We have a very distinguished cast today coming from Turkey, and we are thrilled to have them here at the Fletcher School. You all have their bios, but I will briefly go over them for you without going into too much detail because it would take some time to cover all of their achievements. So Fuat Keyman, starting from the speaking order, Atila Eralp is a member of the Mercator International Policy Center, Istanbul Policy Center, International Advisory Council. He was a senior fellow at IPC from 2019 to 2023. He's also an emeritus professor in the Department of International Relations at the Middle East Technical University, Ankara. His research covers mostly the enlargement process, EU foreign policy, security policy, and Turkey-EU relationship, as well as neighborhood policy. Professor Senem Aydin-Düzgit is a senior scholar and research and academic affairs coordinator at the Istanbul Policy Center and a professor of international relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at Sabancı University in Istanbul. Her main research interests include European foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, discourse studies, and politics of identity. Professor Fuat Keyman is also part of the Istanbul Policy Center. He's actually the director, and he's vice president for institutional affairs and international affairs and social impact, and professor of international relations at Sabancı University. He's a leading political scientist in Turkey and expert on globalization, democratization, international relations, Turkey-EU relations, Turkish foreign policy, and civil society development. Today, we will discuss Turkey's foreign policy orientation, which, according to many international and domestic observers, has shifted significantly over the past decade. We will focus on the drivers of this change, drivers of Turkish foreign policy in general, its making actors and implications of this change, with a focus on Turkey's relations with Russia, the Russian Federation, and the Western world in general. Turkey and its predecessor, Ottoman Empire, have almost always been important actors in European politics. Since Europe's increasing dominance in world politics and the Russian Empire emerged as an ambitious regional player along Turkey's northern border in the early 18th century, maintaining a balance between these two increasingly powerful entities while trying to protect its territorial integrity and revitalize its economic, political, and military power has been a primary task of foreign policy makers in Istanbul and later in Ankara. This has not changed much in the 20th century. After the Second World War, the newly established Turkey, modern Turkish state, joined NATO, primarily to fend off a geopolitical and ideological threat posed by the Soviet Union, which emerged as a superpower in the wake of the war. Resultantly, throughout the so-called Cold War and its immediate aftermath, Ankara primarily aligned its foreign and security policies with the United States and the EU as a NATO ally. Recently, however, especially under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has been in power almost 2 decades, Turkey has pursued a visibly more assertive and independent foreign policy. It has developed close ties with Russia while remaining as a NATO ally and maintained this close relationship even during the war in Ukraine. It condemned Russia's invasion after Russia's intervention, extended material and diplomatic assistance to Ukraine, but also avoided joining Western-led sanctions against Moscow. I want to turn to our panelists, starting from Professor Eralp, and ask what explains this emerging trend in Turkey's foreign affairs, its relations with Russia, and how we should make sense of Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind invitation and for your introduction. It is delightful to be here, to be part of this conversation. We live in turbulent times and dark times, really, when I look at the global system. We are facing many difficulties, many tensions, both globally and also in Turkey, and Turkey's relationship with Russia and the West. In such times, future debates gain salience. There are debates about the future of the global system, future of the West, as well as the future of Turkey and its relationship with the West and Russia. In my opinion, these are defining moments and moments of reflection. So I will start my reflection looking at first, as you also did, looking at the history a bit, Turkey's relationship with the West. And here, when I look at Turkey's relationship with the West, there have been ups and downs in the relationship, as we all know. We see a cyclical pattern, really, in terms of long history of Turkey's relationship with the West. And during the down periods of the relationship, Turkey has looked for alternatives in foreign policy orientation, not in the up periods in its relationship with the West, but in the down periods in its relationship with the West. Turkey has looked for alternative orientation. For example, in the 1970s, there was a drive of third worldism, orientation towards the third world, because of the Cyprus problem, during that time. And in the 1990s, right after the end of the Cold War, again, there were problems with the West, and Turkey turned towards the Black Sea region and the Central Asian Turkic republics, and this was right after Turkey's rejection by the European community when Turkey applied for full membership in 1987 and rejected in 1989. And so there was resentment in Turkey, and Turkey turns towards the Central Asia Turkish republics. And then, Turkey turned towards the Middle East, looking for, again, alternative orientation. And now in the last decade, Russia emerges as an alternative orientation in Turkey's foreign policy. For me, the critical question, which we can discuss, is there a similar cyclical pattern, which we have observed historically speaking, or is it different now? This alternative kind of orientation. For me, it's an important question, and I will reflect on that, you know. When I look at the previous down periods in the relationship with the West, these down periods, they did not last long, you know. I mean, there was a search for an alternative, but, you know, after a while, there was return to the Euro-Atlantic anchor. But now when I look at the present situation, the challenge seems to be deeper and different. At least to me, it seems that we have a different context in the relationship between Turkey, West, and Russia. So we are in a different context, really. And when I look at the triangular relationship between Turkey, Russia, and the West, it has always been difficult to talk about Turkey-Russian relationship without the West. You have to really look at the West to understand Turkey's orientation towards Russia. And the Turkish policymakers had always had close relations even with the Soviet Union, you know, when I look at it, to lessen dependence on the West and increase its bargaining power with the West, you know. Even during the Soviet era, Turkish policymakers always tried to have some kind of relationship with Russia. Especially this has been very important during the down periods of the relationship. For example, during the 60s and 70s, as Turkey was turning towards the third world because of the Cyprus problem, yes, the predominant orientation was towards the non-aligned nations, but at that point, you know, Turkey also established close relations with Soviet Union, especially on economic issues, especially on the issue of industrial, you know, cooperation, steel and iron, you know, factories or major factory was built in Turkey with Soviet Union assistance, really. But again, as I said, you know, these times, you know, were for a short time. There was a return to the Western anchor. Now, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, or the second challenge, which I call, in terms of alternative orientation, came in the last decade, particularly after the 2016 coup attempt. You know, that was a very important point, really, in terms of Turkey's orientation towards Russia, and also Turkey's increasing problems with the United States and Europe. You know, in that sense, 2016 seems to be a critical turning point. And when I look at that critical point, and especially after that critical moment, Turkey started to expand its relationship with Russia in the economic field, not only in energy, but also going beyond that, you know, in trade relations, financial relations, especially as a result of the war in Ukraine. You see increasing trade flows and financial flows, even regarding the sanctioned goods, you know, the Turkish exports to Russia, and there are all kinds of deals with Russia. And the relationship did not stop at that point in the economic relationship. It even extended into the area of defense, as we all know, with the purchase of S-400s. You know, as a NATO country, Turkey bought S-400s. And then, you know, it even included the Kurdish issue, I mean, which is a very critical issue regionally and domestically in Turkey. When it was realized that the United States is not so sensitive about Turkey's Kurdish problem, Russia became more sensitive, and there was more collaboration with Russia on this issue. And especially when the Kurdish issue became more regional in time, involving particularly Syria, you know, Turkish policymakers realized that they needed cooperation with Russia for operating in Syria. So that we have seen increasing collaboration because of the Syrian question as well. And then, you know, as Erdogan felt humiliated by Western leaders, Putin took the, you know, took an initiative here and established close relations with Erdogan, some kind of a friendship relationship, really. And especially after the coup attempt in 2016, again, quite important in terms of Erdogan-Putin relationship. So what I would like to underline, we have seen multi-dimensional relations between Turkey and Russia in time. So it started basically in the economic field, in the energy field, but it expanded to other fields. Now, I don't want to go into detail, but when I look at this second period in terms of orientation towards Russia, it seems to me that, now there is a different context globally and domestically in Turkey, which creates a conducive environment for this kind of an orientation towards Russia. Globally, as we all know, there is the rise of a multipolar system in the context of alternative authoritarian geopolitical modes of governments with illiberal populist political regimes, and there are all kinds of crises really, which helps this kind of a relationship with Russia. And domestically, when I look at the Turkish case, Turkey is a one-person rule authoritarian system, and we also witnessed the rise of anti-Western orientations in Turkey, not among only the political elites, but also even in society. And this configuration, in my opinion, both the global and the domestic configuration, gives Turkey as a middle power to act more flexibly and follow strategic autonomy. This context gives Turkey such a ability, really, a strategic, more autonomous policy, and also ability to balance, really, Western orientation and Russian orientation. And depending on the international and domestic circumstances, Turkey sometimes acts together with transatlantic partners, but more often challenges them and acts differently. I think when I look at the trends, these trends, in my opinion, will continue in 2024, this year, particularly until the elections in the United States, unfortunately, as other illiberal authoritarian leaders, Erdogan and Putin, are expecting the return of Trump and trying to gain time until that, to further consolidate their regimes and to create a closer cooperation. Those are my final comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We can move to Professor Düzgit.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the warm introduction and organizing this panel. Yes, Professor Eralp has already alluded to the fact that Turkish foreign policy and Turkish foreign policy elite and Erdogan himself are operating in a world which they assume to have entered into a post-Western phase. So their assumption is that the West has already declined, particularly Europe, but also the US, and that Turkey now has to find its place in this evolving global order where it should enter into more flexible alliances that should be as transactional as possible and devoid of rules and values and etc., and balance different great powers as it sees fit. Now, of course, this is easier said than done. And the assumption that this is actually based on, of course, is also questionable. Now, of course, on the one hand, Turkey is a member of NATO. It has in the past provided support in various different shapes and forms to Ukraine. It was an important actor in brokering the grain deal in the Russia-Ukraine war. But on the other hand, you also see that it has been blocking the Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO. So it sort of basically engages in behavior that are at times, in the interests of the Western alliance. I'm speaking here, of course, also in relation particularly to the Russia-Ukraine war, but also at times it emerges as a contester of the West, of Europe and the United States. Now, how do we explain this? That is, where does Turkey engage in cooperative behavior, and where does it choose to contest the global order or the international order, and particularly the West? Now, of course, for that, I argue in different research projects and papers, we have to look at the concept of regime security in Turkey and what this concept actually entails. Now, again, if we zoom in on the Russia-Ukraine war, we see that this has provided Turkey the opportunity to demonstrate itself as a useful actor in the international system in terms of using its diplomatic skills, placing itself above the warring parties, but also distinguishing itself from the West because it has not adopted the sanctions regime against Russia. It continues not to do so. And also, but on the other hand, it has allowed, for instance, the Russians to set up a power plant on Turkish soil in a NATO member state. On the other hand, it has sent drones to the Ukrainians, which seem to be quite useful, especially in the early days of the war. But it has then used that drone technology to boost the techno-nationalist narrative at home, which was very helpful and instrumental for the government to achieve victory in the latest Turkish general and presidential elections. And we see that this sort of technological warfare, this techno-nationalism, seems to be present even in this emerging current campaign in the run-up to the local elections that Turkey will have in March this year. So going back to the concept of regime security, where do we see regime security? That is, what are the constitutive pillars of regime security in today's Turkey? I would argue that there are three constitutive pillars to regime security in Turkey, and those are the things that we have to look at when we try to assess where and how Turkey will behave, also with reference to the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, one constitutive pillar is, of course, state capitalism. In other words, Turkey needs funds desperately for its ailing economy and to sustain, of course, the continuation of this patronage networks that keep also the government in power, that keep the regime in power. So you need capital, you need money and funding for that. Another constitutive pillar of regime security is, of course, domestic legitimacy. Well, I mean, of course, as you, I'm sure, are aware, that even in authoritarian countries or competitive authoritarian countries like Turkey, these governments need legitimacy to remain in power, just enough to keep them in power, and particularly among their constituency. And the third constitutive pillar of regime security is nationalism. Well, the AKP and Erdogan are not particularly nationalist ideologues, and they're political Islamists, I would say, but they have been a strong and close alliance with the far-right nationalists embodied in the Nationalist Action Party, which is, of course, ruling the country together in an informal coalition with the AKP. So here, I think these are the three areas. So once the Turkish government is going to take a position on a certain issue, it primarily focuses on what Professor Eralp said, domestic politics. And if you unpack domestic politics and if you zoom in on what this implies, it's regime security and these elements that we're looking at. And I think this is important, not just understanding Turkey's relations with Russia, but also Turkey's relations with other authoritarian countries like, Qatar, for instance, or China, and how it uses these relations as breathing room from its relations with the West, with the European Union, with the United States. This doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to engage in transactionalist relationship with the West. It does. For instance, right now, it is the prime gatekeeper of migration at the EU's borders. It has the migration deal. This week, for instance, the Italian Prime Minister Meloni is in Turkey. So Turkey is viewed from this crisis-ridden Europe that we have today as a country that keeps the migrants at bay, which is a hugely important issue in European domestic politics these days, in countries like Germany and elsewhere in core Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, where you see the rise of the far-right movements that really capitalize on migrant bashing. So you have this general context of contestation and cooperation defined mainly by the need of the regime to attain its security. Now, a final few words about strategic autonomy and how this relates to strategic autonomy. Of course, Turkey flags all this policy under the banner of strategic autonomy. And we know that this concept is not unique to Turkey. We see various different emerging powers or middle powers, or, there are different ways of referring to these countries in the literature, like, for instance, Indonesia, India, even in the West, the European Union, as you know, is a big champion of strategic autonomy. So it's been used by various different actors. But the problem, and I would say the difficulty in the Turkish context, is that Turkey lacks a long-term oriented foreign policy strategy behind this concept. Because on the other hand, yes, you do have certain changes and important changes in the geopolitical scene and shifts in this regional and international order, although we're not certain right now as to the directions in which this will evolve. But on the other hand, the government has its domestic policy priorities, which are driven, as I tried to describe briefly, by a populist short-termism. And there is a contradiction between what these geopolitical imperatives might imply in terms of having a long-term strategy, strategizing based on what Turkish national interest is and how Turkey should position itself, and then, of course, the short-term need to remain in power on the part of the government. So you have this discrepancy growing between Turkey's discourse on strategic autonomy and its actual implementation of policies, which are in fact failing to deliver. For instance, they fail to deliver in terms of increased self-reliance, which the concept of strategic autonomy implies, in terms of economic competitiveness, or in terms of influence in regional and global order that you've also seen very recently in the Israel-Gaza war, when Erdogan wanted to put himself out there as a mediator and broker, but obviously he was not considered, and that has not been the case. So I think I'll stop it here and then maybe come back to some of these issues in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we can move to Professor Keyman and get his perspective on the issue. I will send it to you.
I can try.
Yeah, I emailed it to you.
I have a PowerPoint, but not is working. That's okay.
I think it's not working.
I didn't receive it.
You didn't receive
Okay,
it?
all right. Okay, that's fine actually.
Just
Anyway, thank you very much. Okay, that's fine, Özgür.
Okay, we'll do without the slides.
Yes,
And perhaps you can share them with us.
Okay. Thank you very much, the Fletcher School, Professor Brokowski, Eric, and Özgür Özkan for inviting us and nice words. Let me actually go back to the first point and the title, Turkey, Russia, and the West, maybe we actually think about it in terms of the NATO. They are all very much intertwined and interlinked. And I like to actually put this thing, this three actors in a broader context, and why Turkey, and as Professor Düzgit said, not only Turkey, but starting with France to Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, now we have a new trend, which is called strategic autonomy, which is actually, by which we mean mainly actually countries can pursue their own road and interests without relying too much on the West, but at the same time, we don't know the new thing and new actors, but establish relations with the rest. So the West and the rest kind of relationship. I think, if we go to the broader one very fastly, we have cascading multiple crises of globalization or globalizing world in which we live. I see actually two big confronting, catastrophic ones that will actually affect NATO, West, and Russia, and the whole this actually search for strategic autonomy. The one actually is the age of security, war, geopolitics. Sometimes with Star Wars, they say actually, geopolitics and security strikes back. And we are referring to very, very significant wars. The war in Ukraine, the war in actually Hamas and Gaza, whatever you call it, Azerbaijan, Armenian, and also Balkans are very, very, very shaky. And recently, we are very, very concerned about the regionalization of the war on Hamas or on Gaza, including, Jordan, Iran, and this whole developments between Iran and Pakistan, and then so on and so forth. And also, for a long time, those two countries that have actually some kind of precarious status quo Iraq and Syria. Now they go back to the conflict again. So we have actually a very, very significant challenge coming from a number of wars. And as a matter of fact, when we actually approach Turkey, we should actually see that Turkey is in the middle of these wars and surrounded by these three wars. North actually is the Ukraine war, south actually is the sort of Gaza or Hamas war, might be regionalized, including actually Iran and Red Sea and Yemen. And also we have actually the east, Azerbaijan, Armenian and Armenia and sort of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So in this sense, this issue of geopolitics and war should be taken very, very seriously. The second one actually for me as important as challenging as war is climate crisis. And we are living in the world and this actual world is very, very different. And as a matter of fact, the impact of climate crisis on security is really, really actually devastating. And we cannot think about security without reference to climate crisis, but also we have actually multiple crises of globalization, inequalities, sort of food, water, and land security, poverty and injustice, violence, and other things. So in this sense, as Professor Eralp said, we are living in a sort of cascading dark times, and we don't know what's going to happen, next. My second, slide was when these things are happening, we are also experience a very fundamental, significant international system change. And then there is an acceptance from the West and the rest that post-1945 order is not working. American hegemony is declining and not really shaping and framing regional and global affairs. International organizations, starting with United Nations Security Council, NATO, European Union, although they go for geopolitical turns, but they are not effective in these wars. They are not able to stop these wars. So in this sense, we know that post-1945 order is coming to the end. And I think the 7th of October for me is the end of it. But we don't know the new one. And as a matter of fact, I go back to Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci and what he penned in 1908. And it's very similar to, sort of pre-First World situation right now, what we are experiencing. He said that the old is dying, the new cannot be born yet. In this interregnum, morbid events can happen. I think we are living in an interregnum, and we know that the Western post-95 order is ending and not frame, shape, and solve the problems, but the rest, maybe the rise of Russia, rise of China are very important, but we don't know the new one. So in this sense, very, very big uncertainty, insecurity, and anxiety happening. And as a matter of fact, if I ask this question, because we could actually refer to a number of surveys on the psychology of, individual societies, nationally and globally, three, sort of feelings occur: very, very uncertain, very, very insecure, and very, very fearful, scary, and sort of anxiety. So in this sense, I think this kind of stuff, instead of international collaboration, instead of rules-based international organization, it is actually pushing us towards more and further insecurities through wars. Ukraine is like that. We don't know whether or not the war in Ukraine will end in 2024 or 2025. We don't know to what extent this Gaza or Palestine, the Hamas war is going to regionalize, how much Iran going to be good. Everybody is actually careful, but we don't know the things. And secondly, and more importantly, when we look at this, unlike the Cold War, we have actually a great power competition. Actors are not the third parties. Actors are the big guys. We are talking about United States, France, Britain, European Union, NATO versus Russia, China, and something like that. So in this sense, yes, I will come to this point of strategic autonomy, but we think that actually in this kind of interregnum, actors are great powers. And then we are actually going back to great power competition. That is why references are to Cold War 2.0, Third World War. And as a matter of fact, there is a fear that, for instance, regionalization in the Middle East, kind of coupled with Ukraine war, might create some kind of Cold War 2.0. And as a matter of fact, we know that the new war is not going to be between standing armies. There will be actually a different kind of war through proxy wars, through asymmetric wars, through urban wars and stuff like that. So in this sense, everything actually changing. And in that sense, as Professor Eralp said, we have actually a post-Western world happening, in which multipolarity is referred to, but at the same time, I always, sort of follow India, as Modi said, that big election. It is not multipolar; it's also multiplex because lots of, sort of alliances actually happening in this world. And in that sense, strategic autonomy is not only Turkey's choice, but a bunch of countries' choice is happening because countries think that relying on the West, like they used to be, it is no longer, is a feasible strategy for them. They could actually pursue their own way, but they cannot rely totally on Russia. They cannot rely totally on China because they don't know to what extent they could actually trust these actors. The third slide, actually, when we go to NATO this way, and if you look at the NATO strategic concept, new strategic concept, you will see what I've been saying actually. There is an expansion of NATO. And as we said actually in one of our articles, this expansion is not only geographic, it is also through scope and the content. Geographic, if there are questions, I will dwell on it. But in terms of the Ukraine war, the invitation to Finland and Sweden, to become a NATO member is very, very, very important because through Finland and Swedish actually approval and an entry into NATO, the NATO was going to be able to contain Russia or the West from Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And then Black Sea is becoming a very strategically important. And these kind of, sort of axes are becoming extremely geopolitically important. That's why there has been actually a big sort of a negotiation with Turkey because Turkey played a disruptive role by blocking the Finnish and Swedish actually entries. For Turkey, the idea was different, but for NATO, for United States, it was extremely pivotal to actually include Finland and Sweden because of this containment thing. So Black Sea becomes very important, Baltic Sea and then access is very important. Secondly, members should be multiplied. So in this sense, Sweden and then actually, Finland and Sweden, but the other members will be a NATO and NATO becomes much more global. But the point actually is how to contain the rest in terms of the, war. And the content actually is, when you look at the strategic concept, it is security, it is climate change, it is water, food, and, land security and cyber security. As a matter of fact, we cannot think of security only interstate relationship, only with reference to the state. I think human security, cyber security, food security, these are actually becomes extremely important in this geopolitical term. In that kind of thing, it is extremely important for me, not only academic purposes, but policy purposes, to read the situation very well, as Professor Eralp said. What is happening in a broader context, what kind of change is happening internationally, and how countries should locate themselves in it. Very briefly, in that sense, as Professor Düzgit said, that Turkey, for me, actually made a wrong turn. On the one hand, it was a correct, actually, description, correct sort of articulation of what is going on in terms of strategic autonomy, but the idea that this is actually a post-Western world, the great powers are declining, I can make a difference. So it's kind of an illusion, exaggeration of power and capacity from the Turkey was not actually very well sort of moved. And actually, Turkish foreign policy last 5 years we've been following, especially in the Ukraine war and the war in Hamas and the Israeli-Hamas war in Gaza, is actually, they say that we live in a post-Western world in which we have multipolarity, and these guys actually are not shaping the world. So I can actually have alliances to increase, to sort of enhance my capacity and influence, and I could be actually an actor in this world. So multipolarity / flexible alliances with actually Iran, with Russia, with China, actually that was the actually choice. The second actually part, a pillar of strategic autonomy by the sort of Turkey's foreign policy makers is, if I am going to pursue strategic autonomy with flexible alliances, I have to weaken my anchor with the EU and the NATO. The weaker the, I have our relationship with NATO and EU, the better for me in terms of my maneuvering space with actually the rest, especially Russia and China. So we've actually seen that the anchors are weakening, anchors are being weakened with the NATO and the EU. And then thirdly, as Professor Düzgit actually at the end said that in terms of the decisions and long-term strategies, they actually prefer what we call transactional type of relationship rather than rules-based relationship, because transactional relations in terms of migration and refugee issue, in terms of, for instance, the Ukraine war, the establishment of the food corridor, and then I will give you this, let me get something from you kind of thing. I have a relation with NATO, but I can buy S-400s from Russia kind of. I think this transactional relationship allows Turkish governance in two ways. One actually is they could be a balancer. They could be a broker between two worlds, the West and the rest. And secondly, they prioritize geopolitics and security over democracy. If they have a problem in democracy, you don't talk about it very much because we live in a world, we are actually facing this security challenges and everything. So in this sense, democratic backsliding, authoritarianism in Turkey can be justified in terms of regime security with legitimacy by saying that, the more strategically autonomous we are, the more flexible alliances we pursue, we don't really think about democracy issues and everything. And thirdly, they believe that Turkey, in terms of its geography, in terms of the bridge kind of characteristics, is always pivotal regionally between East and the West, between Black Sea, sort of the straits and everything. So it's a pivotal state with regional power status. So it should be taken seriously. But let me actually finish by talking about four, challenges that I see, and then I will actually dwell on them if there are questions. One actually is the most important one when I compare post-war, post-1945 perception of Turkey in the beginning of Cold War and today's perception of Turkey. I see a big difference from positive perception to negative perception. As a matter of fact, before coming here, we were in Washington and the meetings. Now the new term is Turkey fatigue or Turkey fatigue, because Turkey actually tires you in terms of the Swedish case, Finnish case, this transactional kind of things. And they know that Turkey is important. They know that Turkey should be taken seriously, but it's a tiring relationship, which calls actually to what extent Turkey is a reliable actor in this time that we have serious war situation. And secondly, Turkey actually has new competitors, unlike, again, post-1945 and post-Western. In the Cold War times, Turkey was a buffer state. Or if you guys read the Samuel Huntington and Clash of Civilization, Turkey is a thorn between Islam and the Christian world. But that kind of bufferness, that kind of thornness was actually leveraging Turkey, because Turkey always, winning Turkey was important than losing Turkey. Because Turkey was not really, competing with India, competing with Indonesia, competing with South Africa. But when we look at Global South and who are the actors that are really actually pursuing strategic autonomy, big competitions happen. India, to begin with, actually, Modi-Erdogan conflict, India-Turkey conflict, and every time India makes actually a move, it is the exclusion of Turkey. Brazil, the same thing. And South Africa in this whole issue, how to use law, for instance, in dealing with security. Indonesia. So in this sense, there are new competitors in terms of who is going to represent Global South. If we are going to the West, who's gonna be the main actor of the West? So that's actually good. And fourthly, finally, strategic autonomy for me is actually, yes, it's a kind of a good move effective move, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Ukraine war leveraged Mr. Erdogan and Turkey. Turkey became a broker, Turkey became a corridor and everything. But we cannot assume that what happened in Ukraine war can happen in Israel-Hamas war in Gaza. And as a matter of fact, a Turkey which is actually kind of taken on the table as a broker, as a corridor, now is outside the, sort of the how we're going to actually do the conflict resolution there. So transactionalism is case-based, sometimes work, sometimes doesn't work, and doesn't, enable you to make long-term, short-term, whatever term, but mid-term at least, but strategic, sort of kind of frameworks on which you could actually work and create sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our panelists gave us great explanations about different levels and layers of Turkey's explaining the shifts and continuities in Turkey's strategic posture. Professor Keyman talked mostly about the systemic changes in global politics, international system, whereas Professor Düzgit focused on domestic reasons, specifically regime security, explaining Turkey's foreign policy orientation under specifically under President Erdogan, and Professor Eralp gives us an explanation of a dialectical triangular relationship between Turkey and the West and Russia's involvement in this relationship. All makes sense to me and probably to you guys as well. But what puzzles me is the shifts within Erdogan's term. When we look at the beginnings of the Erdogan's term, like AKP's term, we see a picture of a good relations with the West, Turkey's candidacy to European Union, meeting almost all requirements of Copenhagen criteria. That was a period, maybe until 2007, that was a period of Turkey's speedy march toward political liberalization, democracy, and entry into European Union. My question is, what has changed since then, and how can we explain this speedy shift in the orientation? Whether this, partly panelists responded to that question, but whether this represents a continuity in the broader trajectory of Turkish foreign policy or a break from the past, and how much it is related to the institutional transformation that happened over the past decade in Turkish politics. Because until the early 2000s, Turkish military was the predominant actor of anything that relates to national security and foreign policy, including most issues related to domestic politics. And it was also seen as an impediment for Turkey's march toward democracy and good relations with the West as well. It was seen as an obstacle. With its disappearance, we would expect that Turkey would be more liberal, more political liberal, and more develop closer ties to the West. So how can we, in your eyes, explain this rapid change, zigzags in Erdogan's policy?
I don't know. See, there can be different interpretations to this question, which is a very important question. One can say that, Erdogan instrumentalized the EU issue and also the Kurdish issue for domestic purposes from the beginning. So we were all involved in that EU orientation, we were very active, and there was such a coalition in Turkey. But when I look at the historical hindsight, my interpretation is that, Erdogan was very successful really in instrumentalizing the EU matter and then the Kurdish issue in terms of domestic politics, especially as you rightly mentioned, vis-a-vis the military, for example. And at that point, when I was talking to my European friends, and making this point, they were saying that we need, there is always a need for a common enemy and the common enemy is Turkish military. So the AKP is working to undermine them, and that's good for us, that's democracy. And I was saying that it is quite important, but this is not really democracy. I mean, Erdogan is taking advantage of the situation. And when he took advantage of that situation, but in addition to that, let me also mention that, there were grave mistakes of the EU, especially on the Cyprus issue. And that Cyprus issue, when I look at, again, with historical hindsight, Erdogan personalized the Cyprus issue. He felt humiliated. I mean, I had talks with Davutoğlu at that point, for example. Davutoğlu in those meetings said that, Erdogan came out of the meetings during that phase, humiliated. And then from that point on, personalized the whole issue vis-a-vis the EU, So in terms of these shifts, there is, I would say that there is the Erdogan factor, personal actor, he always personalizes issues. There is the structural factor in the sense that, again, domestic politics and Erdogan using, all these issues in terms of certain domestic issues. And then there is the unsolvable Cyprus issue, which has harmed Turkey's orientations towards the West, towards EU, towards the West, So there could be all kinds of, but then, as Fuat and also Senem said, that we have also global changes, and especially cascading crises, after 2008 in Europe, all over, affecting Erdogan's orientation. And then the feeling was that, in Turkey, I remember in those days, Europe is going down, disintegrating, Britain is getting out of Europe. We don't need Europe anymore, I mean, there was that reading, which took place, among the AKP circles. And then they also became quite successful in elections, domestically speaking. So they didn't need they still need the EU and the West in terms of economic connections, etc. But, they thought that they could really balance now, because in the beginning, they thought that they needed the EU, they needed the Turkish civil society. I remember those days, Turkish civil society was so active, and we were working very closely with the AKP government. Very closely, really, I mean, women organizations, human rights organizations, etc. We were always going to Brussels, lobbying there, But though that was until, as you said, until 2007, 2008, then the whole. And Turkey was even characterized as a country of silent revolution. I remember that. Silent revolution. There were all kinds of moves in the Turkish parliament, political reforms, etc. But then it's golden old days, really, when I look. Changed dramatically. Sorry for my personal interpretation, but I was very actively involved. So it is very sad for me, really, when I think of what happened, really. Yes.
Yeah, maybe just 2 points that I could add. Of course, as you rightly mentioned, I mean, the world has changed tremendously. And when the AKP first came to power, it was those euphoric days of sort of post end of the Cold War EU enlargement, right?
Yeah.
So EU was in a much better shape. It was enlarging rapidly to Central and Eastern Europe. It was branding itself as a transformative/normative power. So that was the context. And plus, it was right around the time of the Iraq War. And of course, after 9/11, when Turkey was perceived as a so-called model in the region, which the United States also needed. So there was lots of Western support and power, and also partly conditionality to change the Turkish regime. And the AKP seemed to be a good partner for it. And that was their discourse and policies at the time. So, of course, what happened over the years, as you rightly said, I mean, so there was a turn towards authoritarianism because of the change in the global context, which enabled it. But also, of course, one has to account for the domestic balances and the changes in domestic politics in Turkish society. And what we have today and what we've had progressively happening over time is because, I'll mention it because you kind of brought it up, is there's been an institutional changes as well. I mean, there's been a whole deinstitutionalization of the making of Turkish foreign policy and a huge centralization of power in the office of the president. So there's been this massive domestic change of deinstitutionalization, which also, I think, contributed, and it went hand in hand, let's say, with this whole sort of this push for a more transactionalist approach and the need for regime security, etc. So really, you don't have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as present as before, or the military, or perhaps even intelligence. It's the office of the president that really holds the key to why and how foreign policy is made. And there, of course, the domestic determinants is the key. So there's a strong relationship between those. So I would like to add this.
Thank you so much.
I'll just say, when I give talks in places like Fletcher School, Monk, or, Woodrow Wilson, for those who are interested in countries like Turkey, I always actually start with a very basic description of what Turkey is, from a domestic and international point of view. For instance, one actually is a post-imperial social formation. It is actually comes from Ottoman Empire, always actually thinks regionally and globally. Second, never colonized. So it is not a post-colonial issue or America. So in this sense, there's always actually this ambitions, this sort of very assertiveness kind of thing. And then third, state is always stronger than society. Like old Huntington say, order is more important than democracy or pluralism. So when we put together, it is almost like, sort of American, sort of a realist, state, the major actors, say, like now Mersheimer's kind of world is always actually in the way that the governors work actually in Turkey. My favorites, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Kissinger, this actually two, despite the differences actually, sort of have a common denominator in terms of Middle East. There are two countries like that, Turkey and Iran. So always watch Turkey and Iran, and then a bit like Israel, because these are actually, assertive countries. So in this sense, foreign policy always, makes a difference, matters, and relations between domestic politics, and foreign policy within the context of what Professor Düzgit said, regime change always matters more than democracy, pluralism, and what goes on in the society. When we look at it from this perspective, I think a turning points for me was the Arab Spring. And then Turkey like that took that, it could be a leader of Arab Spring, actually would be a big casualty of Arab Spring, affected actually, its relation with Europe, its relation with NATO, United States. And secondly, as Professor Eralp said, the Cyprus issue, we actually all involved, but it betrayed by the European Union and the others, and actually Cyprus divided society, were accepted as a member of European Union, which actually created huge problem of distrust actually in Turkey. And third actually is the 2016 military coup attempt in Turkey, which actually really broke Turkey's relation with the United States. And this. So these actually three, made actually a new sort of a context in which Turkish foreign policy makers think. But the point that I would like to make is that although they are right to go for strategic autonomy and everything, is it actually, has it been the right way to go? Has it been the right way to implement? And as a matter of fact, when we look at Turkey, maybe state is stronger than civil, maybe post-imperial, maybe non-colonial, but extremely divided society. Divided in terms of secularism, divided in terms of Kurdish question, ethnicity, otherwise, now divided in terms of, women rights and everything. And as a matter of fact, you cannot actually, continue, country's foreign policy by having domestic legitimacy if your society is too much divided and you are using polarization, severe polarization, for a way of winning the elections, which means you are actually supporting these divisions and supporting this thing. So these are the turns. I think there was a need to turn in the post-Western world, but they misread what it means to be post-Western world. They misread the capacity of Turkey in great power competition. And this misread actually what Turkey can do in terms of undermining the perception of Turkey outside, that actually, there are other actors talking about you as much as you talking about the other actors. And I think this big shift from positive Turkey in the beginning of 2000s to negative Turkey, disruptive Turkey, constructive Turkey to disruptive Turkey, actually now have the main actually reason for the problems that we face.
Thank you so much for all these excellent explanations. I actually feel very privileged to be part of the group and moderating this discussion with the most preeminent scholars of Turkey on these topics. I have several other questions, but because our time is limited, I will open the floor for questions from the audience. We can collect one or two questions, maybe starting from.
Hi, my name is Nayan. I'm a student. I'm also a journalist. I have two questions, one for Professor Keyman and one for Professor Düzgit. For you, Mr. Keyman, there are, as you mentioned, there are a lot of middle powers right now, and in some ways they're trying to punch above their weight. And if you look at comprehensive national power of these countries, they're still on that path of development. And in terms of military development, GDP, economies is not up to the level of a great power. Do you think right now they are exerting their influence? Do you think it's a temporary phenomenon, or you think it has some semblance of a permanent nature? And these middle powers, or a group of these middle powers, have the capacity to create the post-Western world order that you mentioned. My second question to you, Professor, is there's a perception in at least in developing countries that policymakers and policy analysts in the West, Europe, more in the US, they have a problem of thinking in binaries. Either you are with us or you are against us. Now these countries, the middle powers like India, you mentioned, Indonesia, Turkey, they do a lot of transactional dealings. They believe in deal making rather than alliances. What would be your advice to Western policymakers and analysts in terms of how to deal with this changing world order and how these middle powers are dealing with the West and obviously at Russia and China at the same time?
Thank you, Nathan. I will get one more question, Sarah, maybe.
Hi, Sarah Vaughn. So thank you so much for speaking. I have a few questions relating to, there's a lot of discussion about multipolarity as a concept. And I think what I'm wondering then is, where do you think Turkey falls within a multipolar concept? Is it a pole? Is it more of the middle power? Is the concept of poles completely off base? I guess I'm wondering, because it seems like there is kind of a discussion of a post-Western world, a shift to multipolarity, but people don't tend to define what that means. And I guess I'd love your thoughts on that and maybe some further definitions. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, when we talk about middle powers, we are also talking about the very problematic concept of global South. And of course, when I go back to my PhD times and before Cold War, we had actually a tripartite world, first world, second world, and third world. And at the end of the Cold War, what happened was the third world was gone. So we're no longer able to actually differentiate. We have emerging powers, we have actually BRIC and everything. But and then Charles Kupchan actually wrote a great book, The West and the Rest. And we always actually look at the critic of the West. And of course, the critics are right. They are double standards, imperialistic, like Manichaean and everything, but not much actually attention given to the rest. Like what kind of relations we have actually in the West. Or the question actually is, who is going to represent the West? Like, for instance, China says that I am the representative of the West. When China is the representative of the West, then what are we going to do with the middle powers in relation to China? Because it is not very feasible for middle powers to be very close to China when we look at the way that China actually expands in the world. And secondly, Russia. And then when we look at actually Putin's article, just before it published, just before its invasion of Ukraine, said that there is no Ukraine. There is no Ukrainian, there is actually Russia there. So it's a very like first world or kind of situation where actually you deny the existence of people and go there and invade on the name of the very, very illusionary, constructive, discursive idea of, who is what and then what kind of identity kind of thing. So Russia is not actually very reliable too. So I think that, we have actually two kinds of problems for middle powers. One actually is who is going to be, representing what in the global south. And so there are actually different options. For instance, I'm going to go back to this multipolar thing. If you look at Modi, and Modi prefers not multipolarity, but multiplex relations, because on the one hand, we have actually security relations, but on the other hand, that's why I started with the climate crisis, we have a different kind of alliances there. Then we go to the food security, you have a different kind of alliances there. So it is actually much more cluster way than simple multipolarity. I don't think that the simplistic idea of multipolarity is work. I agree with him that multiplexity, that's what actually my PowerPoint is. It may be way to go. Or Danny Roderick and Stephen Walsh actually, sort of article and how to think about the world in a different way than war and climate crisis, because they have actually multi-layer understanding. Maybe there is a America-China conflict, inevitable, but that doesn't mean that it is zero sum. They might actually cooperate in climate or food or something like that too. So in this sense, the second one actually is the competition among the newcomers, new boys or new guys on the block, that Brazil is a different vision. And they don't like actually Turkey being in that vision. Or Modi in the great, sort of G20 and BRIC, meetings, that he has a new corridor from India, Saudi Arabia and Greece, and excluded Turkey. And then Mr. Erdogan said, you cannot exclude me by establishing corridor. So in this sense, I think for you guys, like, sort of taking this broader context seriously, I think we should actually look at the West and the critic, take it seriously. But I think the focus should be actually on the rest and what kind of power configurations that are happening within the rest. So going back there, I prefer much more multidimensional, multiplex kind of things than multipolarity, because multipolarity is not going to operate as we understood from the textbooks, that we have unipolarity America, bipolarity, Soviet Union, Cold War, now multipolarity. No, I think there will be much more complex, the relations and flexible alliances there, depending on which area you are going to look at.
Maybe I'd like to, I agree with this, but maybe to add on to this, one other thing I think that's necessary is to listen to these powers and particularly try to understand and respond the justice claims that come from them. I mean, if you look at the way in which much of the contestation of the West occurs, it's mostly driven by the hypocrisy charge, right? And EU, sometimes US, etc., and especially the European Union, because they claim to be a normative actor or they claim to be this and that. But then if you look at actual foreign policy practice and other discourse on other concrete foreign policy matters, there is a massive discrepancy, right? Which makes them very vulnerable, open to this hypocrisy charge. I think it's important to recognize and acknowledge that there is a legitimacy crisis of the existing order or the hegemonic capitalist, Western dominated order. And that, to have a meaningful dialogue of equals, there has to be some measures to remedy this, whether it's climate justice, whether it's redistributional justice, whether it's colonial justice or post-colonial justice, as we see in the retribution debates, etc. I think it's very important to do that. So I'd just like to add that. Yeah.
These are critical questions, especially the question on multipolarity and how to locate Turkey there. In the Cold War, it was easy, Turkey was a frontier state, in the containment policy, and that was very clear, But now it seems that in this multipolar world, Turkey aims to be a regional actor, orienting itself to the south, basically a global south. But the critical question here is, in Turkey, we have been used to a have an anchor, you know. Even in a multipolar world, are you going to have an anchor or really be flexible and floating around? And now, for a while, you know, there was an anchor. And even today, you know, when you think institutionally speaking, Turkey is part of NATO. Turkey does not want to give up that, you know. I mean, there are ideological challenges and everything. But in terms of institutional links, Turkey is still part of NATO and Turkey is still part of EU's customs union. So there are those institutional links which Turkey does not want to give up, which means that still, you know, there is some kind of an anchor, you know. So this, you know, it is, you are right, you know, it's a very important question. In terms of, you know, these middle powers, are they able to create the post-Western world? Again, very important question. In my opinion, very difficult because they are also exclusionary. See, West has been exclusionary in terms of its multilateralism. It was a exclusionary multilateralism. And when we look at the global South and the new actors, you know, they are also exclusionary. So you cannot create a new world if you are exclusionary. You have to find a way to include, you know, and it should be inclusionary. And also they are quite unilateral. How can you be, you know, how can you create a new world if you are unilateral? Again, so.
Thank you so much. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Lazarus. My question would be, would you say that one major weakness of Turkey is its economy in order to achieve its ambitions? And would the fact of having a good economy entail to have strong institutions and a less personalized you know, political system? And if the economy is not healthy, would the risk be a vassalization of Turkey, not only from the European Union, which would be maybe the better scenario, or even from China?
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Philip. I'm German, and my question is about kind of German-Turkish relations, especially from a domestic kind of point of view, because we do have, I think, around 3 million German-Turkish citizens in Germany, and they do say, right, that Berlin is like the second or third largest Turkish city in the world. What strikes me, and I'm not as, you know, well aware of like Turkish relations as I should be, but what strikes me usually is that Erdogan seems to have quite a voter base in Germany, which is quite a contrast. At the same time, we in Germany rely on Turkey, as you say, on the refugee agreement and all that. What would your hope be for kind of Germany and how we should approach Turkey to kind of facilitate like a better relationship, but also with an eye towards like liberalism and kind of supporting those movements within Turkey in a manner that's kind of feasible as a foreign state.
Can I get your question as well?
My question?
Yes, because our time is limited.
Oh, okay. So in the 2010s, Turkey's relationship with the two big Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia and UAE, were as bad as any relations in all of Europe and the Middle East. Erdogan accused Sheikh Mohammed of Abu Dhabi of organizing the coup in 2016. UAE and Turkey were essentially in a proxy war in Libya. Turkey helped rescue Qatar when Saudi Arabia and UAE tried to overthrow the Al Thani family in 2017. And Erdogan essentially engineered what was a very successful multi-year global blacklist of Prince Mohammed of Saudi Arabia. And in the last couple of years, they've totally changed their tune. It's been almost dizzying. The countries are meeting together all the time. Erdogan has been presenting the Gulf states as an economic savior. I hear from the Arab foreign policy thinkers that this is essentially a sign of victory of the Gulf states, that they beat Turkey on the big question of political Islam and democracy, and that everything's fixed. But I want to hear the Turkish perspective. Is it really all water under the bridge? Is this now truly a close relationship of trust, or is there still some suspicion?
Yeah, you know, I mean, you had such an important question, really. and this is I would say, the puzzle of transactionalism. You become transactional, but then economy needs, rules and institutions and a rules-based system. And one of the problems in Turkey is really this, transactionalism. And Turkey has all kinds of relations with the EU, and there's a customs union relationship, which is based on institutions and rules and everything, but there are problems there. So, and also, again, when you look at the Turkish case and such cases, backsliding in democracy and rule of law affects economic policy as well, because economic policy also depends on rule of law. So there is that big problem of transactionalism, really. And Turkish economy is in crisis, so it needs really, better performance. And in terms of that better performance, you need the modernization of the customs union relationship with the EU, but there are all kinds of difficulties because of rule of law situation in Turkey. So there is that, vicious circle, really, which we are facing.
Well, and I think I'll just take it from there. It just creates a situation in which, for instance, you mentioned China. Would China be interested in having Turkey as a vassal, or invest or do business in a country where even they have questions about the rule of law, right? Because you don't have to be a democracy, but you have to know at least that you will protect the rights and, of a company if something goes wrong, etc. That is been, damaged in Turkey and to an important extent. So I think the problem is perhaps bigger than just what the numbers suggest. And the danger would just not be a vassalization, but perhaps, complete, further destruction of the Turkish economy. And also, of course, the whole increased skewed nature of income distribution, the hollowing out of the middle classes, where you have the entourage and the government and a certain minimal sort of, upper class and the working classes and people on minimum wage extending. So the Erdogan's constituency is minimally protected, but the rest just leave the country with a brain drain, huge migration coming in. The risk is about Pakistanization, I think, more than anything else. And I think we need to watch out for that. And that is the bigger risk that I see for Turkey. Now, coming back to the German-Turkish relationship, I appreciate the question because I'm currently based in Berlin, actually, as a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Bosch Academy for a while now. So I have also been, because of this, obviously, the relationship between Germany and Turkey and German foreign policy, etc. And what I've been seeing is that, Germany is in a very difficult position here because on the one hand, they have certain economic interests, businesses to protect. They have the Turkish diaspora, which is a divided diaspora, by the way. I mean, we always, draw attention to the fact that the Euro-Turks or German Turks in Germany vote for AKP, yes, but then you also have a considerable part of that diaspora that is in opposition, that recently migrated because of the brain drain, or the Kurdish diaspora, which has been there for a very long time anyway. So there are huge divides. So the German government is in a difficult position when they take a decision on Turkey or make a certain move. That's because the number one thing that I've noticed that filters into their calculation is how would this impact on diaspora and their votes, right? And so this makes it quite difficult to do so. But I mean, from a personal standpoint, I would say that it would be in the interest of both parties for Germany to continue engaging with Turkey, to continue its, prominent actorhood as, the country in the EU that sort of, that still engages with Turkey more than the French and the others. And that also continues to engage with the Turkish opposition and Turkish civil society, right? In terms of the rights-based movements, for instance, women's rights, gender equality, climate movements, etc. I think this is the most important thing to do, to at least make sure that the Turkish opposition remains intact and alive and vibrant despite repression and authoritarianism and centralization of power, and to make sure that the rule of law is always there. There's the basis of engagement as much as possible, which is difficult to do so in the current context when you have geopolitics that's the game in town. But Turkey is still formally a candidate, even on paper, right? So it does get progress reports delivered. So Germany, it cannot just do away with the rule of law question. And I think it's important to underline that.
Then I take your question and you know, a couple of weeks ago there was a super game, a soccer game. You know, the champion Galatasaray. I am a big fan of Galatasaray and Fenerbahçe that was taking place in Saudi Arabia, and the first time. But of course, when this is taking place in Saudi Arabia, we are also celebrating our centennial, 100 years. And as divided as it is, big debate in Turkey, whether or not the Turkey's this Super Bowl kind of game can be played in Saudi Arabia in a time we are actually celebrating Atatürk and I you know have attended a YouTube sort of a program or like sort of said whether Saudi Arabia dislikes Turkey or Erdogan. You know, the question is like, because we have to figure out like what is happening. Historically speaking, let me actually finish this one. I want to say something about Turkey-Russia relations too. Historically speaking, like I'm going to come back to Saudi Arabia and Gulf, and it's a very important question because we always in Turkey think from Turkey to Gulf states. But we're going to think about from Gulf states to Turkey, how they see Turkey and their relation with Turkey. In the Turkey-Russia relations, we had actually three critical moments. One actually is the anti-imperialist war and the beginning of Turkish Republic, 1923. Atatürk has very good relations with Lenin, and as a matter of fact, you know, Russia and after the revolution plays crucial role for Turkey's victory. You know, and then Turkey becomes an independent nation. Second, in the Cold War times, actually there is actually a Turkish Prime Minister Demirel and Khrushchev relationship in which, as Professor Eralp said, that impacts very much on the Cold War. Turkey is very, very close to the West, and the Soviet actually is seen as the main enemy. But you know, Turkey's industrial development depends at that time very much on their investments or Russian help in the actually industry, steel and the others one. And third, Erdogan-Putin relationship. And when you compare this, I had a little article like that. In the first one, it is symmetrical, based on equality and on the like good for Turkey. Second one, Cold War times, symmetrical, Cold War Turkey. But Erdogan-Putin relations is asymmetrical, is good for Putin, but not always in actually, sort of Turkey. And Turkey finds sometimes itself in a very, very weird, very, very scary situations because of the Russian kind of, involvement and things like we see Syria and Iraq, and we cannot do very much about it. Similarly, with the Gulf states, and I was actually having the similar kind of, because of this game, I was thinking about it, like whether Saudis don't like Turkey or Erdogan kind of thing. And actually they like Turkey because it goes back to Atatürk times. And in the Atatürk times, there is relations and they admire. As a matter of fact, one of the first, sort of queen of Saudi family is a Turkish woman. And it says that I don't want four wives, I want only one wife, and Faisal accepts that, and then now actually IFET University in Saudi Arabia comes from this woman. And then in the Cold War times again, but right now, going back to the first question about the economy, it is very terrible for us to actually have this relationship in coup attempts and this and that, and all of a sudden there is actually kind of nothing happens and let's have good relations. But that's actually economy, because Turkey has a very, very severe economic problems, and they go actually there. And then they think that actually we could actually have those relationships. And the Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Qatar buy everything in Turkey. We have actually even racist attitudes towards Arab because it's an Arabization of Istanbul kind of thing, and all the constructions and this and lands and everything kind of thing. But from an IR point of view, which I do, then when you look at actually how Saudis, Emirates look at Turkey, they don't do the same thing. They are much more rational. They are much more strategic autonomy and much more interest oriented, because they always actually sometimes good for Turkey, but exclude Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, and Greece. And or Saudi Arabia said, I am going to be the leader of Middle East. They surpass Turkey. And as a matter of fact, when they actually have a relationship with Iran and proxy wars, they exclude Turkey. So as a matter of fact, asymmetry I see actually happens right now, where they give you money, but in return, actually, they have what they have, they get what they want. Whereas Turkey has this facing disruptive ambiguity, gets the money from them, but I don't know what gonna happen, or we don't know what's gonna happen next, kind of thing. So I think I have a similarity between the unfolding of Turkey-Russia relations at the end, asymmetrical, and Turkey-Saudi Arabia. Of course, Emirates come later and Qatar, but Qatar is the broker in the Gaza deal, not Turkey. Saudi Arabia gonna be a broker with the Pakistan things, not Turkey. So I think they are much more strategic than Turkey. Anyway.
With nationalism, populism, and nativism remain to be a driving force of global politics, and with global order continue to change, and with Turkey's opposition, political opposition still remains to be divided, I think we will continue to be puzzled by the questions the Erdogan's personalized foreign policy presents us in the future. So keep following Turkey's relations with Russia and the West. I think that will help you make sense of what is happening in the global scale as well. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you, and I appreciate your presentations today. I think we can end here and we can continue with the lunch.
Yes, and thank you, Özgür, for masterfully moderating this conversation. Thank you to our three panelists for sharing your expertise and your very valuable insights, and to all of you for your questions and for engaging us in this discussion. Please do join us for lunch, and we can continue the conversation there. So thank you.
Siz de öyle.